Hi, I'm Gary Ralph, and this is another lecture in the glorious series of lectures that I'm giving for History 101, Europe and the World, Part 1. And today, I'm going to be talking about the terrible 1300s. I mentioned last time that although from the 10th century onwards, there's a kind of gradual improvement in things. In fact, I have a little rough chart here. Roman Empire at its height in the period in the 2nd century AD when Edward Gibbon said it was the one time in history where he would have liked to live because everything was peaceful and productive and everybody had enough to eat. And then there was the fall of the empire in this period that we refer to as the Dark Ages, and some people refer to it as the Middle Ages or medieval time, which is actually just the literal translation of Middle Ages, and during which, from what we know about it, Europe was at the very least undergoing substantial reorganization. It may not have been such a terrible time for people to live, but it was certainly a time during which, from a historical point of view, it was pretty chaotic. Then there was, beginning in the 1000s and on, there was this gradual economic revival where things were beginning to pull themselves together again and become organized in a modern way, really. This is the beginning of when we see modern Europe emerging. And then there is this decade of the 1300s buoy where it goes down again and then goes up. And we do eventually end up in the Renaissance, which is a great period for Europe. There's an old expression in French, reculer pour mieux sauter, which means that sort of like when you're trying to make a big jump, you hunker down and then that you are able to leap farther. And some people say, well, that's really what happened in the 1300s. I mean, for the people living in the 1300s, it was a really terrible time. But in fact, the setbacks of the 1300s enabled the Renaissance when it came to be that much more glorious. And I will talk about that idea later on. But from the point of view of people in the 1300s, it was falling apart. Things were going crazy. I don't often recommend particular books for people to read, but if you want to know more about the 1300s or you just want to really read a very well-written book, you might check out Barbara Tuchman's book, A Distant Mirror. I had the honor of meeting Barbara Tuchman about 35 years ago before she died. And she is not necessarily well regarded among professional historians. She herself was not a professor at a university or anything like that, but she really knew how to write a good book. And she undertook to write A Distant Mirror because at the time the AIDS epidemic was starting. And of course, one of the things that happens in the 1300s is that you have the Black Death. With the coronavirus thing going on right now, there's another example of relevance. But she said she wanted to write a book to see what happens when the world is under siege, really. I mean, when things are just so terrible that nobody ever sees how they're going to be able to get out of them. And that's really what happened in Europe during the 1300s. One of the things that happened was a kind of a religious crisis in the church. The church is an organization, and this involved a couple of events that we refer to as the Great Schism, the Avignon Papacy, and I'm talking about those later on at the beginning of the tape about the Reformation, which I made at a time when I didn't know I was going to be making videos about the entire length of European history. But it's also a kind of separate problem. The Avignon Papacy was a terrible thing for the Christian church, but it's not really something that affected people in a very visceral, physical way. And the things I'm going to be talking about now are things that did indeed affect people in a very physical way, beginning with something called the Great Famine. You can kind of guess that a famine is not an intellectual situation. It's a situation where people are really physically suffering. And the Great Famine was sort of I don't know if you might call it the result of the economic revival, but it was sort of one of the things that unexpected consequences. I mentioned that the economic revival involved global warming and people having larger crops because of the global warming, more food, and therefore more people because they had food to feed the people, so they had more babies. So there was a big population boom in Europe. I mean, it's hard to make statistics, but it's pretty clear that there was a lot of people being born in the 1100s and 1200s. And things catch up in the Great Famine. I mean, it turns out that they've overshot. They've even though there's more food, they've had still more people than there is food available. Also, there was global cooling because the world goes through this pattern of getting warmer and getting colder. Some of the land that had been opened up during the global warming period and had become productive farmland turned out not to be that much productive. There is some farmland that you can get 3 or 4 or 5 years of crops out of, but then you have to, the land becomes quickly exhausted. This is one of the things, by the way, that they're discovering in the Amazon river basin. A lot of this stuff, where they went in and cut down the Amazon rainforest in order to make farmland, it turns out that though that land is very good for Amazon rainforest, it's not very good for farmland. So we've got the forest gone and we've got the farmland not very productive, and so nobody wins in that situation. And also, there were drawbacks in terms of heavy rains for years and years. So the amount of food, the amount of food began to retract. B, there were already all of these people, more than really could be fed by even the amount of cultivated farmland in a good year. So lots of people died. And also lots of people were weakened by the Great Famine. And that made it, let me see if I can get myself, yes. That made it even more dangerous when, in 1347, the Black Death arrives in Europe. Various theories about how this happens. To begin with, we're not absolutely sure what the Black Death was. Most scientists and most historians of medicine today say, well, it's what we today would call the bubonic plague, because the descriptions of the physical reactions to the disease are similar to what we see today with people who have what we call the bubonic plague. But for one thing, diseases change over time. They mutate. And although what people were suffering from in the 1300s may have been something like what we think of as the bubonic plague, there were probably also differences. Also, it's very difficult for us to go back in history and try to figure out what diseases people actually had, because, well, one way of doing that, by the way, is every once in a while the archaeologists or people who are digging up the earth for historical evidence come across a bunch of people who, from all of the indications, seem to have died during the period of the Black Death. And to begin with, two problems. One, it's very hard to tell. Sometimes it's hard to find out what people died of 700 years later. Also, can you imagine what you would be feeling like if you were an archaeologist and you started digging up bodies and you said, okay, these people died of the plague. Is the plague actually dead yet? Could I get the plague from these dead bodies? And there's really no way of knowing. So there's still, I was giving this lecture a few years ago, and I said it was the bubonic plague, and some student stood up and said, oh no, Professor Ralph, you're all very wrong, which is a bad thing to do, by the way, if any of you were ever in a classroom with one. It's some other disease. I read some article recently, and it's some other disease. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, from the point of view of the Black Death, it's hard also to tell how many people died from the Black Death in Europe because we don't really have dependable statistics. But some people say that as many as 2/3 of the population of Europe died of the Black Death. That's a lot of people. And we also are not so sure about how it got to, I have this sign that I showed before. How did it get to Europe? One of the things we see happening is that the historical records we have for the 1300s, which are not always great, suggest that a couple of decades before the bubonic plague shows up in Europe, there had been something very similar in China. And as I pointed out, in the 1200s, there had been the establishment, after the initial pioneering efforts of Marco Polo, there had been trading directly between China and Europe. Boats would take off from China and they would sail around the, whatever overland. I don't think they discovered the route around the end of Cape Horn yet. But the implication was that the fleas that give people the bubonic plague had latched onto rats who had gotten on the boats, who had come up to the Mediterranean and infected everybody with the plague. It's possible that happened, but there's no way of proving it. Also, the plague did not just have one appearance in Europe. What we call the Black Death is what happened in 1347 and the years afterwards, but from time to time, something that people called the plague continued to appear in Europe for actually hundreds of years. So we can't really blame the Chinese for that one any more than we can blame the Chinese for coronavirus. The Black Death, certainly in the short term, was a huge crisis for European civilization. Aside from so many people dying, the people who remained alive were, doing their level best not to die. Some of them literally locked themselves up inside a castle. They got as much food as they needed and locked themselves up. This is what I'm doing right now because of the coronavirus. Although I didn't hoard, I'll assure you of that. Some people sort of went crazy and said, the only way to avoid getting this disease is to go out into the courtyard and dance. So there were all these people who were dancing to try and, there's a folk song, Sur le pont d'Avignon, on y danse, which means on the bridge of Avignon, everybody's dancing. And the supposed subtext is that the reason they're dancing is to keep away the plague. So there were nobody really understood how the plague was transmitted from one person to another. So there was this kind of superstitious idea that various things that today we think of as really irrelevant would possibly keep the plague away. People thought it was a scourge from God, and so they would become penitents and they would dress in, hair shirts and uncomfortable clothing and make pilgrimages to try and stop the plague. Now, when we look back at this, historians one of the things that historians have decided is that in a way the Black Death was a good thing. Because for one thing, I mentioned that there was more of at the beginning of the century, there was more of a population in Europe than could be fed. And that was no longer the case after the Black Death, because the population had been severely reduced. Another thing that we see happening is that because so many people died, the wealth that was in Europe was concentrated in the hands of a few people. Your uncle would die and he would leave you his stuff, and your wife would die and she would leave you her stuff. And then instead of the new wealth being spread out in small amounts across Europe, you had a few people who had a lot of economic and political control, because all of the economic and political control had gone to the people who were still surviving. The result was that certain people had large quantities of capital that they could invest. And that made it possible for big things to take place. The big events of the Renaissance. The Renaissance would probably have not been so big and fancy if there had not been these few people who, really as a result of the Black Plague, had had the resources to start amazing, wonderful things like, paying for Columbus to go discover the Western Hemisphere, things like that. So it seems a little heartless to say that the Black Death had an upside, because for the people who died of the Black Death, there was no upside. But you can interpret it that way. I'm going to stop right now and move on to the next horrible thing that happened in the 1300s. See you in a minute.